Next in our chapter, we'll be talking about depression and various drugs for depression that we have used throughout the years. We're going to be talking about various kinds of medication, both drugs for depression and then drugs to stabilize mood. On page 195, box 10-4, we see some symptoms of depression listed. Risk factors tend to include a family history of depression, substance abuse, drug use, a history of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, and then chronic illness. We're going to be talking about several categories. The SSRIs are probably the ones that we're most familiar with. SNRIs help to control norepinephrine rather than serotonin. Tricyclic antidepressants are a little bit older. They've been around longer than the SSRIs and tend to have a lot of side effects. They're still used, but not as much for depression anymore. And then a category called the MAOIs. Now, we talked about MAOIs, when we were talking about in the previous chapter. But this is just monoamine oxidase inhibitors that are used more for depression. They're also an old school type med. And then we'll talk about some atypical antidepressants, ones that don't fit neatly into any of these other categories. So the first category of drug we're going to talk about are the SSRIs. They are not the newest types of drugs. They were introduced in the early to mid 80s. Prior to that, all we'd had were drugs with quite a few side effects, and before those drugs, we didn't even have that, and people often ended up in mental institutions and treated quite cruelly. There were ice water submersion treatments. They would put people into insulin comas, hoping that would help snap out of it. I guess it's like trying to turn your computer off and turn it back on again. They tried various types of other drugs and kind of accidentally discovered some antidepressants. And it was only when the 80s rolled around that we developed some what we called SSRIs, or selective serotonin uptake inhibitors. And we saw a video prior to this that showed the idea of uptake, the nerve taking the serotonin back up and sort of recycling it so that the brain doesn't have it to send messages. And so these types of drugs try to stop that. So they keep the central nervous system from reusing serotonin and not letting it be available for mood changes. We try to use it on a short-term basis for outpatients that have been diagnosed with major depressive disorders. And it's used long-term, sometimes for years at a time, for what we call dysthymia and minor depressive orders. Dysthymia is considered to be just a condition where the person is just kind of low-level depressed. They just go through their lives not really taking any enjoyment in life, but still able to get out and work and have the appearance of being able to get along. Now, these drugs can be very effective, but it can take up to a month for the person to even start noticing any improvements. Usually, escitalopram or Lexapro can start working a little bit sooner. Some patients report that they feel an elevation in their mood as early as 1 week with Lexapro, but the rest can take 3 or 4 weeks to even start feeling an uplift in their spirits, usually what happens is that they notice they have a little bit more energy. And it can take a month before their mood feels any better. There are a lot of adverse reactions with the SSRIs, and these are talked about on page 197. Loss of appetite initially can be one of them. There's also an issue with sexual functioning. Sometimes people report feeling sleepy. And the biggest risk probably is suicide risk with rising energy, which we will talk about a little later. Make sure you read what the ATI book says about depression on pages 49 to 51, and the textbook talks about it on page 198. In the ATI, also, when they talk about these drugs, they talk about serotonin syndrome. Back when we talked about antipsychotics, we had neuroleptic malignant syndrome. That was a bad reaction to too much dopamine and a rise in that neurotransmitter in the brain. Serotonin syndrome is somewhat similar to that, only it's the brain reacting to a sudden rise in serotonin. And it can happen as soon as a couple hours after the person starts taking it, or if they're already taking something and then they combine it with a drug that also increases serotonin. So it can be pretty dangerous. You need to read and know the signs and symptoms of serotonin syndrome, and you also need to know what bruxism is. Bruxism involves tooth grinding, and that's found as one of the kind of weird side effects of SSRIs, particularly Prozac, but any of the SSRIs can do that. And so there are some various things that you can do to help this. The sedative buspirone that we talked about in the last section has been shown to help, as well as mechanical treatments like just wearing a mouth guard when the person goes to bed at night. When it comes to the prototype drug for the SSRIs, fluoxetine or Prozac is the drug that we're going to use as our example. And a lot of these side effects and the action is true of all the SSRIs. But Prozac is one of the first that was developed, and one we hear of pretty often.